welcome. My name is Tiffany. I am the owner of Tiffany Cosplay LLC, which is a company that focuses on costume and prop fabrication as well as education part. Ta-da! I am the cosplay guest this year, and I am from the United States, originally Texas, but currently because of Air Force, we are stationed in Nebraska. So we moved from basically close to Mexico to the middle of nowhere in the States. So, yeah.
And you love it.
Enjoy winter.
It's okay. I have winter now.
You've got winter right now.
I know!
Yeah.
Fun fact, I first saw snow 4 years ago when we moved to Nebraska. So yeah, it's been a learning curve of things, and it's cold for me.
Less tornadoes.
Oh yeah, they're scary. Whoa. But anyway, I've been cosplaying since 2008. I do this professionally, so it is my full-time job, and I am really happy for y'all to come here at this early 10:30 a.m. panel. Hopefully y'all didn't get a little too much happy juice in you last night. So yeah, but we're gonna be talking about advanced airbrush painting. Thanks. I already talked about myself. Next. Okay, so here's some of the topics that I'm going to be going over. I kind of wanted to focus this panel not just on doing advanced techniques. I wanted to do it more focused on some advanced painting on different types of cosplay things. So I'll do a basic recap for if anybody has not airbrush painted before, because this is technically an advanced one, but I'll try to kind of go over that a little bit. Priming your pieces before airbrush painting, masking because nobody wants tape residue or your paint peeling off when you're going to your next layers, gradients, using stencils, painting on leather, which is one of my favorite things to do, and then painting wigs, so stuff like this. And then I'll have some time for Q&As at the end. Okay, basic recap. Next. Okay, so start off, there's some safety stuff with airbrush painting. So you do need to wear a respirator. Just because you don't see or smell something doesn't mean it's not in the air, particles, it's really bad. Also, if you don't want airbrush paint on you and the different types of paints, chemical gloves, so latex gloves, and then also safety glasses. So I say this because when you are painting up close, specifically if you are doing miniatures or details, when you're painting this close with your airbrush, the airbrush is putting your air and your paint onto the surface, but it is also bouncing back. So if you're having issues with your eyes being dry, stuff like that, that's probably the case. So yeah, safety glasses. Yeah. And I put it in temperatures for y'all because I'm Fahrenheit and not Celsius. So yeah, these are the best recommended temperatures. So for y'all, 18 to 29 degrees Celsius. And of course, airbrush painting, it is really affected by humidity. I don't know how much y'all have here. I don't know your climate.
We're dry.
Okay, then y'all are pretty good. Just your paint's probably gonna dry a lot faster than normal. So yeah. Right, so different layers. So I am technically sponsored by Createx Colors, which is an airbrush paint company. I'm also sponsored by Iwata Airbrush. They don't sponsor me to say anything nice, they just provide me stuff because I paint a lot. And I love their products. I was using it before they sponsored me, so most of the stuff I'm gonna be talking about is their stuff because I use it. So all these paints are Createx Colors, and each of these are the exact same color on both sample. These are EVA foam samples that have been primed with Plastidip, and one side has a base coat of white paint and the other side has a base coat of black paint. To give you an idea of painting with layers, whatever one is underneath will sometimes make your color change quite a bit. So something to be aware of, always testing out your paints beforehand, doing light coats and not just going straight up and painting with the color that you want. And then I always recommend, if you've never airbrush painted, Do not buy fancy equipment. To start off with the very, very cheapest of Amazon kits and destroy them, because you will. And those little kits typically last you around 2 years depending on your environment, temperatures. Being in Texas, the issue I came across with most of the stuff is you have what's called like a rubber O-ring in a lot of the products, and they dry rot, they fall apart, and that causes problems for your pressure to go through the airbrush. And you don't want that, you want it to work perfectly, not to mention all of your airbrush starter ones, like on the left, on the bottom, yeah, they're gonna get clogged, you gotta learn to clean them. So after doing all of that and destroying your first one or two, I recommend upgrading your airbrush. They are an expensive upgrade, but at this point, after like 2 or 5 years, however long you feel comfortable with painting, figuring out which type of model you want, and then purchasing that, and that will last you basically forever, and you won't have to replace it. So these are actually 2 that I use at the bottom. The left one is the Iwata Eclipse, and I like a top fed, which is where the paint goes through the bucket on top. And then the one on the right is the HP TH2 from Iwata, and that one for someone doing a huge sword like you, I'm calling you out. So doing big, huge armor pieces, armor builds, or just anything like that, your spray is going to be so much larger, and your bucket, as you see, is that big compared to that big. So you have a lot more flexibility of doing larger pieces and not having to constantly mix the same color. And then for the top, I have compressors. A lot of times with the basic compressors, they're again only gonna last like 2 years. And then I recommend upgrading to one that is larger. Typically they have the, but you have a bigger tank at the bottom, bigger compressor at the top, and that's gonna make it so your paint will be able to go more even constantly. So yeah. All right, priming. And I don't know if I got over 2. Yes, I'm going to go over foam and 3D printed priming, because those are the most common for cosplays. And I'll kind of talk about that. So, all right, so talking about EVA foam, I always recommend to heat treat your foam first. Basically, it is using a heat gun, image on the left, and your foam typically is very porous. So it's like this. By using a heat gun, it's going to shrink those pores, causing them to come together, and then it makes it so your paint is not being absorbed inside the foam, so you're not having to put so many layers. It also gives you a nicer, smoother surface. And for doing it afterwards, I prime my foam with Plastidip, which is a rubber spray paint. Specifically for foam, it makes it really easy to transport, and you can also bend your pieces. It kind of holds your foam together a little better, in my opinion. Plastidip is something that you will need to apply normally 3 to 4 coats on both the front and the back. It has gotten quite a bit expensive though in the last couple of years. So yeah, and then, did I mark? No, I didn't mark that. But for doing Plastidip, you do need to wait 24 hours for your last coat to dry before starting to airbrush paint, just to make sure that it's not just the top layer that's dry, but all the way underneath. Because when you are using your airbrush gun, the airbrush and all of the air going through in your paint is going to slightly push through and could potentially, if it is still wet, go through that top surface underneath and make it so your Plastidip doesn't sit on the surface correctly. So, of the foam, sorry. Next. All right, and then for 3D printed parts, so this is also a product from Createx Colors, and it is their auto blend sealer. I always recommend this for doing tons of tests throughout everything to figure out the proper thing for painting, is using this material. Basically for 3D printed parts, for resins, anything that's plastic, if you're painting on top of Warbla, which is more of your plastic surface too, this I would recommend doing as your base coat and then waiting again 24 hours for it to dry. It's basically gonna make it so your surface can then have the paint stick onto it and not just drip off. And nobody wants little drips with your airbrush paint, especially if it's really thin. All right, And then masking, which is a huge thing with painting. So. And this is some of my really old work. If you're familiar of Diablo and the character Tyrael, this is some of the armor that I made back in 2018 when I was first learning to airbrush paint and mask things. And you can see the image on the left that there's a bunch of tape residue on top of that surface. This is a EVA foam that has plastic dip on top. And basically when masking, never apply your masking tape directly to plastic dip surfaces. It always needs to be applied to a painted layer. And that goes with even doing airbrush painting or anything. And it's gonna be really, really helpful for just going through. So I was trying to mask off first the silver so I could paint the gold, and then vice versa. And you really don't need to do that with airbrush painting. Just only paint or only mask off pieces that you've already painted, because you're painting in layers, so you need to put more layers underneath anyway. So just having that mist doesn't really hurt. But you can kind of see a little bit, like in this areas where the paint residue shows through, or I'm sorry, the masking tape residue shows through, and it's normally an undesirable texture on your foam surfaces. So, and how I recommend doing masking tape is don't use blued painter's tape. It's terrible. I always like to use the Scotch Constructor grade tape. It is a little more pricey, but it's going to give you the best results. And basically with the tape, how I do it is take the tape and literally put it to your leg or your clothing, and then put it onto the surface. It is then going, unless you have tons of cat hair or dog hair, try to not have a super hairy surface of yeah, I have 2 cats, so it kind of depends on the situation for me. But I've found that this way you never have an issue with the paint being too sticky, and when you peel it off, removing your paint and your plasti dip onto the foam surfaces, as well as for 3D printed parts. And then I like to use needle nose tweezers to get those nice little corners and kind of push it into certain spots. So image on the top left is the Wanderer's hat from Genshin Impact that I was doing. And then the other 2 are keyblades, so just masking off parts. I also would recommend for larger covering of areas, because tape can be expensive, if you have computer paper, or if you've printed something and you don't need that paper anymore, using that to cover parts, and then just use the only part that's going to attach to your surface with the masking tape, and that's going to save you a lot. So that's kind of the bottom image, where the far left is technically the handle part of the keyblade. So I used the computer paper there to mask off. So. All right, gradients, and these are one of my favorite things to do. This is actually an image of, if you know League of Legends, the character Nico. This is the Star Guardian, her lizard tail thingy, and it's actually EVA foam. I did this one a long time ago. I'll go over it a little bit more in the next slide, or a few slides. But basically, with airbrush painting, you don't have to airbrush to make gradients while the paint is wet. So for this instance, your airbrush for the paints, if you do red and yellow, and then even if they're dry, when they kind of overlap, you're having this speckly splatter, and it's your eyes that are visually going to cause that gradient to look like it's going to start to turn orange in the center. So that is how we're kind of going to talk about it. You can mix it while it's still wet, but you don't have to. And then also, depending on which, if you have been painting a lot, which I hope, you'll probably understand this, but when you're closer with airbrush painting, your paint is going to be more solid. So all of the paints, which is the speckles, are going to be more together, where if you're farther away, it's going to be more lighter kind of random spots. So that's how you can kind of control your gradients as well, where if you want a more solid pigmented color, you would be closer, and then when you're trying to go to your next color, pull the airbrush away from the surface, and that's gonna leave less of a paint pigment there, and it's gonna leave more of a mist, causing you to do that more gradient look. So, and then this is kind of how I did the tail. So starting from the top left, working to the right, and then bottom left, working to the right. And I did more of, so base coat on the foam of the Plasti Dip, and then doing white, just so it would have a bit of paint underneath, and we're always painting in layers, so adding onto that so the pigments will show. But doing a darker purple first, and then because these are much larger pieces, by the time, like this tail, that swirl part is like this big. So by the time I'm done coloring one part, a lot of it is already dry, which is why you don't technically have to do the gradients while it's wet. By doing this process, you would do your dark purple here, and then I typically will go with my next color here, so it's more closer to the surface, so you have more of the pigment. And then I would go either way, feathering it out, so pulling away, so you have a little bit of that mist, and it's going to gradually make your eyes see that as doing a gradient. And then continuing this way of more of the red, and doing the same on both sides, going to the pink, and then to the peach, orange, and yellow. And that kind of helped to give that look of the natural gradient going through. So hopefully that kind of helps with doing gradients on that. Next. So you can see the finished Nico tail. And then I also did it with both the key blades. And it's really fun to do it when you go to like the blues, to the white, to the yellow, just to make that mist kind of fluff go out. And it really gives your props more life, rather than just solid this color, and then you don't have to use a paintbrush to also kind of mix them together. And then stencils. And I'm talking about stencils a little bit differently than your traditional airbrush painting stencils. I want to be a little fun for y'all. So if you've used stencils before, you've probably purchased one. They're these plastic sheets that are a lot of times like this big. They'll either have flames on it or scales. Well, I'm gonna tell you how I make mine. Okay. And I like to use the Cricut sticker paper, and you don't need a Cricut to use this, and you don't need a laser cutter technically. So I'll do my design on that, and I'll have it cut out, and you can use this because it's clear. You can take it off and you can see where your design is. And so right here, I'm putting all of the sticker paper on top of my fabric surface. So I already have the base coat painted the dark blue, and then putting my stencil on. And then afterwards, I would airbrush paint it with the color that I wanted. And because it is a sticker, it sticks to the surface. Where if you're holding a stencil and you're spraying, most likely your stencil is, going to come up, and you're going to have a mist go under your stencil. So this makes it so you can have a much cleaner line surface. And then when you remove it, which I'm using tweezers too, just because it's more easy, you get a lot cleaner lines. So I did this part from a dark blue, I did my gradient up. So originally, you could see here, it was the kind of lighter blue, putting stencil on top, then covering, next one of the gold, and then removing, and you get all these nice little pieces. And you don't have to do this just with fabric. It works for any material, whether it's foam, 3D printed surfaces. I will say with the sticker paper, it's more of a thicker material. It's almost 1 millimeter thick. So when you are going on a rounder object though, you might have it where it doesn't fully stick to the surface, just so you're aware. Especially if you have like small cutout pieces, it might start to, instead of going naturally around, it might start coming upward on the edges, so just to be aware of. But you can always go back and paint with airbrush paint by hand. If you don't know, you can use just a basic paintbrush using the same paint, and go through. So, next. And then that's Milo from Genshin Impact, and the entire skirt over here was all pretty much airbrush painted. This part was this light blue color, and all of the bottom was all done with a stencil doing a gradient, and then this was the other part that I was just showing to kind of the little bow tail parts. And it's really nice to get cleaner lines rather than trying to, like, I shake really bad. I can't, like, I'm surprised I can do a straight line. So by doing the stencils, it really helps with that rather than trying to get those little straight lines with the airbrush. So, yeah. And then this is my Lilith costume from Diablo, and this is all leather, pretty much, but with this middle piece, the red part, I used it onto EVA foam that's been covered with fabric. It's been airbrush painted for weather, and then I ended up airbrush painting the white part. And with this stencil, I ended up cutting out just with an X-Acto knife to get all of those lines. And because your sticker paper is normally see-through, it makes it where you can just do your design underneath on a piece of paper, and it makes it easy to then be able to cut out. And you can just like tape it to a table, onto a cutting board, or cutting mat, sorry, and then cut it out with an X-Acto knife. But yeah, this one was a lot of work, a lot of work. Yeah, I'll go over that more in the leather part. Other ways to do stencils is masking tape again. This is all fabric as well. This was for my Hu Tao costume from Genshin Impact. She has these like a suit tail parts that are very intricate, and basically I drew on my design on the fabric. And when airbrush painting fabric, I will say you can't just put it on a table. It's so lightweight, you fly away from your airbrush with all of the air coming through and the mist. So typically I will put it on either a piece of cardboard or foam board that's sturdy, and then I'll do the masking tape around. So if you are painting any type of fabric or other lightweight materials, make sure you leave a little bit of area around your piece, because you need to have room to put that masking tape on, and then you can cut down to the actual size of your material. So like if you wanted to do this color but paint all the way to the edge, that paint wouldn't reach under your masking tape. So just be aware of where your area is. But for this, basically on this one, I started with putting the whole area on and doing my brown. And I did not cover up all the other parts because airbrush painting is layers. So we're just gonna paint over afterwards anyway. But once those were done, I used some masking tape to cover it up. With airbrush painting onto any type of fabric or lighter weight materials, be aware that the paint is going to seep through the material. So all of these splatters here actually somewhat kind of goes through to the other side. So if you are painting, your top surface might be dry, but what it's sticking onto might still be partly wet, especially if it's a cardboard, if you've heavy saturated with paint, or if you have a really thin down paint. You want to be aware that you're giving it more time to dry than what you would normally do, just so all of underneath what you can't see is dry. But going from the brown to the gold, and did have to paint a few layers with it just because you're kind of going from a darker material, and then to the red to give you this. And then for the specific red kind of fluffer part, her design kind of has it where it is a little bit more pigmented on the edges, so I just went in with a paintbrush on the edges to kind of give that more control. And that was that part. Painting leather, which is also one of my favorites. This is actually, the background image is my permafrost cape from World of Warcraft, which was all leather. It's one of my favorite things. I normally bring it as an example, but flying international makes it a little more difficult with bringing things. So yeah. I always recommend with airbrush painting leather using veg tan. So this is more of your white leather. It tends to be more cleaner. You can paint on darker leather, but your colors may vary. And this was for my Atlantic Mercy cosplay from Overwatch. This was pretty much all veg tan leather, minus this background part was a black cowhide, just because I needed a bigger piece of leather. So it was all one. And then for here, doing the gradients, I ended up using, it was called Tester's paint, and they got rid, at least in the US, they got rid of their airbrush line. So yeah, I really loved them, and then I found Createx, and then Createx brought me in and was like, okay, I'm staying here. But yeah, they were a great paint line, but you can do this still with any of the paints. And just doing the gradient that I talked about earlier, all of these pieces are actually the detail parts that are on top of here. So I ended up attaching them with leather weld glue, which is a specific leather glue. And then I sewed them on with a leather needle and sewing machine. So they're pretty fun to do. With painting leather, it is a little bit different than painting most other materials, because your paint is actually going to be going into the material a bit, which means you don't need to apply so many layers. You actually want it to be more lighter, because when you build up on leather, it tends to become more solid, and it turns into more of like painting with hand acrylic paint and gets more flaky. So you do have to be cautious with painting on layer, doing less layers, and also with doing it, I don't do a base layer for painting on leather, because the veg tan is basically your white surface. So you don't need to do that white airbrush coat first, because everything is already going to pop on top of that. The only downfall is if you're using a darker leather, such as black cowhide, those sometimes you may have to do a light mist of a lighter layer if you're trying to get to that desired color. Okay. So yeah, here's some of my leather pieces. So the one on your left is Lilith. That is all 100% leather. So the corset part, the gold sections, are all veg tan leather that's been glued together. And before I attached it to the leather breast area and bottom parts, I ended up airbrush painting it, starting with a the gold color, and then I went back through, which, does it show on y'all's? Not so much. Okay, so I did my shadowing with a black, and then after that was dry, I did a tiny little mist of the gold. And a fun little trick is you can actually use airbrush cleaner on a paper towel and lightly use it as a buff. It'll remove the top layer of paint and make it where you can see underneath. So that makes it so all the colors underneath can show through a little bit without having to add too many. You just have to be very aware that you do need to properly seal your paint afterwards. Otherwise, the airbrush cleaner is going to continue to clean down, and you don't want that. But yeah, so for the details on that, it's technically a blue color because I was trying to mimic actual metal, and one of the patinas that I really love is when there's blue colors. And so by using more fluorescent blues, mixing it with salt, and then putting it onto the surface with a paintbrush while it's wet, once it dries, the salt actually, because it's a mineral, causes your paint to do this kind of weird mineral look. I don't know how to explain it on that. But then from that, you can just kind of rub off some of the salts if it's too flaky, and then seal it on top, which I always use Createx Colors UV Sealer. It protects your paint from the UV lights and everything. It also makes it so if you're using different types of airbrush paint, for instance, Createx Colors has like their Candy Coat line, which if you're familiar with Iron Man, that whole movie outfit, costume, I don't know how you say it, was actually painted with specifically Createx Colors Candy Line to give that vibrant gold and red. And so if you're using that paint versus using a more kind of acrylic-like paint, they're definitely two different surface finishes. So by using the different UVL sealers on top, it's going to make it look even. So, and they have with that one a matte, a satin, and a gloss. So you can choose which type you want. And then the one on the right is my permafrost cape. All of that is on leather as well. And that is the base piece, which is one piece of leather, was black cowhide. And then I ended up having, for these small little purple pieces, I ended up having a pig hide for that I painted just because I wanted a thinner material, because all of these pieces had to be sewn. And if you've worked with leather before, building up the layers gets pretty thick, and if you're going to hand stitch that or sewing machine stitch it, will definitely affect that. And for me, I was using a sewing machine, so I had to be very cautious or very aware of how thick my layers were to make it go through my normal sewing machine, because I don't have an industrial one or a leather one. But all of the gold pieces on here, it's actually 3 different sections of gold that's been layered up of different leather pieces, and all of that was the same veg tan leather, using the gold chrome paints on top, and then putting each piece down with the leather weld. Sorry. So using that and then stitching it with the sewing machine. So next. Okay, and then painting wigs, because that is starting to get really big in the cosplay community now. So yeah, I'm gonna go over how to paint one from scratch, not just what I have here, which is the yellow color, and then painting the bottoms and then the tip part. Starting from scratch, I always recommend getting a base white wig. This is gonna make it because you want your base color to have all the colors be vibrant, so this makes it very nice. Also a rat's tail comb, because with airbrush painting on synthetic wigs, so if you're familiar with putting mascara on your eyelashes, it is basically putting your material over it. It's not seeping through it. So you have to comb this through and be aware that it may kind of flake off in parts if you put too much material of the paint, which is why a lot of times they'll say use the RIT dye, synthetic RIT dye, but you might not get as vibrant of colors that you would with airbrush painting. Next, please. So with doing this, basically with a wig, if you've never worked with one, there are different strands which are called your wefts. And what you'll want to do is start at the very base of the neck and pull all of your material up, and you're going to work from one weft to the next, going upwards. And you'll apply your coat, and while it's still wet, you're going to pull it through. This is so you don't have it in giant clumps. It's going to make it more even going through your material and spread it out. Next, please. And to kind of show you the process of going from left to right, doing purple, spraying it, and then working my way to the blues, going down, and then kind of going up towards the top of the head, doing a blue to a green gradient, and then at the very top was a orange-red kind of color. I will note you do need to, with doing wigs like this, let it dry as you go. It is a long process. It's not just a paint. It's not like going to the salon and getting your hair done and colored. You have to give it the proper time to dry. Some downfalls of airbrush painting wigs, which we'll see by the end of this weekend. Your airbrush paint onto wigs does not always stay, and on a white material will start to rub that color. So be aware with your costume, if you're wearing a long wig, you may have that come onto the surface of what you're wearing or onto the collar of your neck piece of your garment. So yeah, next please. And then this was the final wig for that one, which was Star Guardian Nico from League of Legends. And that one was a pain of a wig to make, but it still got the concept across of the multicoloredness and everything. So yeah. And then I think the last one is Q&As. So if you're using plasti dip on top, it should be fine. I've done it before and the plasti dip typically stays, but your masking tape, because the surface of your hot glue, I would try to avoid using any type of masking tape on top of your hot glue. If you're painting directly onto the hot glue and you're not doing plasti dip, I would recommend using that auto-borne sealer, because that's basically making it so it's kind of like if you have two plastic surfaces that are really smooth and you use epoxy, they don't bond. So you need to use sandpaper, and it's kind of creating that tiny little bit of sandpaper texture to make your paint stick.
I'm thinking specifically of when, like on EVA foam, you use hot glue to make like small raised details, right?
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so doing plasti dip and then just try not to use any masking tape on top of it, it should be fine. I've done that process with puff paint, and I have no issues. So when I had that issues, I was in Texas. We get very, very hot, very like all over, terrible painting in the garage.
Yeah. It's the same.
Okay.
Sure.
But when that was happening for me, I was using the basic airbrush, just out of the kits. It's like $100 kit with the three airbrushes. You get paint, you get the compressor. It's all cheap Chinese stuff. The O-rings constantly broke. They don't typically have replacements. So I just ended up figuring out which one of those three I liked, and I would buy a specific cheap one of those when I was first learning out. So I actually went through probably like 3 or 4 basic ones to learn to paint, and figure out which type of cup that I liked for the paint to go in, whether it was a bottom fed or a top fed. But when I switched to Iwata, I've been painting with mine for probably 5 years now, and I haven't replaced it. They have specifically, though, every single part for the airbrush replacement parts, and their customer service is wonderful of like helping you figure that out. So depending on where you are in your airbrush career, either buy another cheap one or slowly invest into a nicer one that you won't have those problems with. So when you use heat on top of an airbrush painted wig, you are more likely to damage the airbrush paint on top because it is just sitting around the fiber. So you're more likely to have it start flaking off. So I don't recommend doing that. If you are, I would crimp it first and then move it. So when I did that wig, I wasn't crimping it anymore. I was just hairspraying and gluing. I will say different types of hairspray sometimes will react to what type of paint you're using. It may cause it to kind of come back alive. And like if you're using red and you do tons and tons of hairspray, it sometimes will start coming on your hands more again. So you have to kind of wait for it to dry. It's a balance of figuring out what you have and depending on your paint and everything. I'm just using the straight Createx Colors paint. So with the, I don't know what's the best part. Maybe this? I'm fully color coding. So all of this, it's just light weathering. It's not huge painting or everything. But I find that their candy line, which is more of, if you worked with ink before, it's really liquidy. And with that, you can water it down, the candy line from Createx Colors. And that works pretty well for painting on any type of fabrics. You also don't have to worry about adding, like you can keep adding layers and layers. And I do this with any type of fabric material. I typically will go to that paint line just because you don't have to worry about getting acrylic paint chunks on your fabric that no longer looks like weathering. It looks like a mistake paint chunk, I guess. Does that make sense?